basically I'm going to talk about food production and agriculture. Just because I talk about it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be on your unit test in virtual school. And just because I don't talk about it doesn't mean it's not going to be on your unit test in virtual school. Okay, so basically, I went through the unit and I picked out what I felt based on my experience teaching AP Environmental Science, what I thought were the most important topics for the course, and then for that unit, and then you know, went from there. So just because I don't mention something doesn't mean it's not necessarily going to be on your, you should still read through the content within the course. But this is just, based on what my experience teaching AP, what I think is the most important information from this unit. So basically, there was something called the Neolithic Revolution about 12,000 years ago, and that's when agriculture and animal husbandry were introduced. And so before that, we were kind of like hunter-gatherers. We just kind of like walked around and like found food and like hunted stuff as we went. But in the Neolithic Revolution, they actually started standing still and planting crops and harvesting um, and like growing animals or animal husbandry, kind of raising animals to eat, which allowed people to then stay still, right? You don't have to go search around for food and stuff like that if you're growing your own. Um, so that was kind of a really important um, revolution or advancement. And basically, all the major crop plants that we use now were established in the first 1,000 years of agriculture. So we haven't really come up with much that's new since then. We're kind of sticking to the same old, same old. And then until about 150 years ago, most of the people in the United States lived and worked on small farms. They kind of had plows and things like that, and they harvested their own food and then also some to sell. And then with the mid 1800s, they had the Industrial Revolution. So you can go from plowing your fields with horses and oxen and things like that to actually using machines, which really revolutionized agriculture. Farmers were allowed to grow a lot more. They were able to grow a lot more quicker and on smaller plots of land, would then allow other people to not grow stuff because the farmers made so much extra, and then they could go do other jobs. And so now we have about 3 million farmers and farm workers, and they produce enough food for the United States, plus a substantial amount to trade throughout, globally. And then still, though, 15% of the total United States workforce is farm and farm-related employment, so people that have to do with farms. Okay, so this is like one of those big plows. So you can see it's a lot different than using a horse. In 2003, the irrigated acreage was about 18% of all cropland, which is about 683 million acres, or 40% of the world's food. This is a really common way that people irrigate, and you can see it's just a ton of water. And so what they have is, let me see if I can draw this. They basically, this thing it's called center pivot, and so that thing you're seeing right there is kind of a long line like that, and then the water, kind of comes off of it, and it spins in a circle like that. That's why they call it center pivot. And then that's why when you're flying from an airplane or whatever, and you see these fields that kind of look like this, that lets you know that those are irrigated, because they have that, they're extra green right there because that's where that center pivot irrigation is. It's really easy, and it doesn't take a lot of work, and it's cheap, but it uses a lot of water. And I know we've discussed how over irrigating the water or your land can cause salinization. One of the things that it can cause is salinization. So that's kind of, obviously an issue with irrigation. Plus, it's just a lot of water. So in the Green Revolution, what they did is, this is a period where advancements in crop production actually doubled the yield. So they were getting twice the amount of food out of the same amount of land. So what that does is that means your farming is more efficient, And it's the equivalent of, basically having double amount of land, right? So if you can get more crops in the same amount of land, you're not using as much land, which means you're not going to cut down as many forests and or native habitats and things like that. So it's definitely more efficient. Okay. And so basically, kind of what happened with the Green Revolution is in the 40s, the Rockefeller Foundation sent 4 scientists to Mexico with the objective of exporting what we use in the United States for growing food to the developing countries. And then in the late 1960s, a lot of countries changed from being grain importers to either stable or exporters of grain. So, hi Dia. So what we've their objective, was met basically. The developing countries got this extra technology and they started being a lot more efficient with their food. And so basically in only 35 years, global food production doubled. And you can see in this graph, right? You can see that a lot of places started increasing their food production. Is Sub-Saharan Africa is kind of at the bottom. It's kind of stayed pretty constant, but everything else has gone up a decent amount. So this is kind of what I was saying earlier, that the Green Revolution, basically by doubling your yield, you don't need any new land, but you're still getting this double the amount of food. Okay, so you could feed more people with the same amount of land, which can protect us from having to cut down more forest or get more agricultural land to feed our growing population. So some impacts of the Green Revolution, right? There's always good and bad. So in the early years, that was the beginning of the Green Revolution. More recent research has focused on like pests and disease and how we can get these plants to resist climatic stress, like the increase in temperatures or increases in rainfall or decreases in rainfall, depending on where you're at, how that's going to affect your climate and your rainfall. It allowed us to get more food production in Asia and Latin America, not so much in Africa like we saw on the graph. And without the Green Revolution, we wouldn't be growing as much food. So our prices would be higher and we would be using more agricultural land. So it was overall pretty helpful, but we are taking this technology and bringing it to other countries. So then you are having more fossil fuels to grow your food and stuff like that. So then we have this thing called subsistence agriculture, which is basically what they're doing in sub-Saharan Africa and some other really rural places in developing countries. They use traditional agricultural methods. So farmers will live on really small parcels of land. That'll give enough food for the family and hopefully some leftover that they can sell. This is practiced in most regions with the most rapid population growth, because there's lots and lots of people, growing, but it's actually not really suited for high densities of people. It's really suited for low densities. And it's more environmentally friendly, because you're not using big machines and things like that to grow your crops, but you're also not very efficient either with your land, right? You're not growing as much per acre as you would on a larger farm using more modern methods. But basically, this is subsistence agriculture. It's basically what feeds most of the world's rural poor. Okay, so people that don't live in cities, that are very, very poor, this is what they live on, and this is how they eat. Then we can talk about animal farming. This is also big business. So a quarter of the world's croplands are actually used to feed domestic animals. So we are growing crops. 25% of the crops that we grow are used to feed animals, not people, but animals that then get fed to humans. Okay. So about 70% of our grain crop is used to feed animals. And that's about 4 billion livestock and about 18 billion birds. So livestock is like cows and pigs and things like that. And birds is like, turkeys and chickens and things like that. So there's a couple ways you can grow these animals. I'm going to say grow these animals, but I guess raise might be more a better way. In the developed world and sometimes in developing, but mostly in the developed world, they raise these animals in what they call CAFOs, which are confined animal feeding operation, I think is what they call it. But like on the AP exam, if you can't remember that, CAFO is fine. They know what that means. And basically these animals are raised, you can see here, like in really, really close quarters, and they're raised primarily for food. That's like all they're there for. Okay, sorry. And then you can also raise these animals on like family farms, right? Subsistence farmers can raise them, things like that. Now, you know, if your next door neighbor has like chickens in their backyard, that's not really what they're talking about. They're talking about like an actual like farm that would probably more look like maybe Charlotte's Web, but not as um, nice, maybe. But just like family farms that these people are and these animals that they grow are or raise are basically, you know, their families living. Where the CAFOs are usually owned by like corporations, and they're not usually family run. So the big thing with these CAFOs is they produce a lot of waste. Okay, you know, you've got a lot of animals in a very small area. And basically all they do is feed them because they're trying to get them big and fat, you know, to sell them. So if you're eating a lot, you're going to go to the bathroom a lot. So that's a lot of urine, and that's a lot of solid waste that is going onto the ground. Not all of it is going to soak in. Some of it is going to run off. Okay, and some, when it runs off, it can go into surface waters like lakes and rivers and things like that, which can cause fish die-offs because pee is or urine is basically mostly nitrogen, so then it's increasing the nitrogen level in those waterways, which then can contribute to eutrophication, which can cause a lack of oxygen and, you know, a cascade of effects, which can then cause fish to die. Any pathogens or diseases or things like that that are in that waste will then, you know, obviously contaminate that water, like you know, E. coli or whatever. You know, then that gets into the water, and then if people drink the water, that can be not excellent. And then the proliferation of algae, which kind of it leads back to the fish die-offs and the eutrophication, because basically eutrophication causes fish die or a proliferation of algae, which then uses up they die they and then the bacteria and things that are eating the dead algae then use up all the oxygen, and a lot of time that's what causes the fish die-offs and the eutrophication. And the EPA says that animal-based agriculture is the most widespread source of pollution in U.S. rivers. And this doesn't include also methane and things like that, which we'll talk about. So what is a problem with these CAFOs? They are really, really crowded, and so they're the perfect condition for diseases to incubate and also spread, right? Because if you have a lot of animals really close together and one of them gets sick, you know, a lot of them are going to get sick. When the avian flu outbreak happened, more than 140 million poultry died or were purposefully destroyed. That means they killed them because they were sick or they were exposed to sick birds, and that infected more than like 400 people. And then salmonella as well also causes a loss of 2.5 billion per year in the United States, and that's not only animals, right? I saw a recall the other day. It wasn't the other day. It was like a few months ago, but it was like salmonella on spinach. So it's not just animals that can get salmonella, like eggs and things like that. So climate change is another problem, or it's related to agriculture in a way, and because basically to have more fields for growing crops or for raising livestock. In a lot of places, they will cut down forests. Okay, when they cut down forest, um, not only is the burning of the forest, a lot of times they'll burn the forest. They call this slash and burn. A lot of times when they burn the forest, they will burning releases carbon into the atmosphere, but also you're also losing that sink, right? Because trees and forests and things like that, those things eat is not a very good word, but they use carbon, right? They use carbon dioxide. And so they kind of act as a sink and they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But if you don't have that forest, not only are you releasing carbon into the atmosphere by cutting down the forest, but you're also releasing carbon into the atmosphere, or not releasing, but you're making it even worse because those trees that you used to have are not sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere anymore. And then livestock, they also release, this says 30 million tons of methane per year. Probably it's a little more than that now. And basically, all of these animals that are basically grazing, they eat grass. Grass is, causes gas. If you eat lots of plant products, we can't really digest the chlorophyll and stuff like that very well, and basically causes gas. And so like 3% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are released by livestock. So that's a huge amount of methane, basically cow farts. I don't know if you can necessarily say cow farts on the AP exam. You'd have to say it probably a little nicer than that, but basically that's what's going on. So if you have well-managed animal agriculture, you can enhance the soil, right? You can take all that waste, and if you use it constructively, you can, use it to enhance your soil. It's basically like a compost, right? I had a friend when I was growing up, her parents would get cow compost, basically, which is like almost like cow poop almost. It's not exactly, but it's kind of close. And they would use that to, for their yard and also their flower beds. Okay, so it can enable farmers to maintain a balanced ecosystem, and it's more likely to be sustainable if you're having it in a rural farm or like a well-managed herd than in one of these CAFOs. So then kind of switching gears, with agriculture, another thing that we use our crops for, so we use them for food. We use them to feed animals, and we also grow animals on that land, and then we also use them as biofuels. So ethanol and some oils are derived from agricultural crops. They consider this renewable energy because you're not using it from fossil fuels, even though a lot of times they use fossil fuel powered devices to harvest the crop. And so about a third of the 2008 corn crop, so that was 10 years ago, was completely devoted to growing from ethanol companies. And basically the farmers will sell to the highest bidder. So if the food folks, are going to pay you this price and the biofuel folks are going to pay you a higher price, the farmers are going to sell their crop to the biofuel folks because, it's more expensive. They get more money for that, even though it's not necessarily providing food for people. So what causes our food prices to go up? The price of oil is a big one, okay, because we need oil to transport the crops. We need oil to do that harvesting with those fossil fuels. And so all of that is, that goes into the price of your food. Any bad weather and poor harvests. I remember a few years ago there was like something happened and like most of the pumpkin crop died, and like canned pumpkin was like crazy. Like my husband worked at a grocery store at the time, and he brought home some canned pumpkin. It's like, it's really, we're really running low on the canned pumpkin, and it's really, so here, I brought you some. And I was like, great, what do you want me to do with this? But it just, if there's some bad weather or poor harvest or whatever, it's going to cause issues, and it's going to cause a high food price, right, demand. And then the rising demand for meat and animal products. So the more meat that we eat, the more of our crops then go to feed this meat that farmers are growing, which means there's less grain for humans to eat, right? And so that rises the price, that causes the price to rise as well. But really, because a lot of folks think that biofuels is what's causing the increase in price, like, oh, we're using too much of our crop on biofuel, and that's why the food price is going up. Well, really, only 30% of the grain price increase between 2000 and 2007 was actually linked to biofuels. So the majority of the price increase was to those these top three things. Okay, so how can we make agriculture sustainable? We can increase our crop yields, right? Which it has a finite limit, but we're not there yet. We can increase our crop yields. We can grow food on land that is now used for feedstock, which is food for animals, biofuels, or just cash crops. But agricultural sustainability is highly dependent on soil, water conservation, and the weather. Okay, those three things are very important. Weather/climate. They're kind of the same. Well, weather is a short-term version of climate, kind of. Climate's what you expect, and weather is what you get. That's what folks like to say. And then, so this one, it should cut off the top of the slide, but basically, like, most of our grain is used to feed people, to feed animals. But if we used that to feed people, it could buffer against world hunger and people. So basically, like, they talk about eating lower on the food chain. What they mean is, like, instead of eating a cow, right, which is a herbivore, which means it eats plants, a cow is going to take more land to grow than the food that fed the cow, right? Because only 10% of the energy is passed to the next level. Or if you ate some sort of predator, I'm trying to think, like, people don't really eat like wolves and lions and stuff like that, I don't think. At least not commonly here. But say you were to eat a meat eater, right? It would take a lot more land to grow a meat eater than it would just to grow the plants that fed the herbivore that then fed the meat eater, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times eating meat is considered a sign of prosperity because you can afford the meat. So a lot of times, folks want to eat meat because then that basically shows that they're a little more prosperous. Then, eating meat is a little more exciting than like eating bread all the time. So the trend is actually going in the opposite direction. People are wanting to eat higher on the food chain rather than lower. So then we can talk about genetic engineering for agriculture. I know that's part of our, I've seen you guys writing a couple posts about that, and the genetic engineering, or the genetic testing at least, of the fish. But basically what it is you're incorporating traits that you want into animals. So you're producing animals that this comic is kind of a joke, where they're producing a chicken that has all these extra legs, so then everyone gets a leg. And basically that's what a GMO is. This is a genetically modified organism. It's more modified somehow. McDonald's used to have a lot of genetically modified potatoes. They would use them for their French fries, and then folks found out about it, and now they don't use them anymore. So we can take genes from bacteria or animals or plants and put them in animals or put them in plants. The glowfish that you see in the pet store, those actually have like jellyfish genes in them that cause them to glow. You can put pesticide resistance in your plant. You can put all sorts of stuff in there, but a lot of folks are concerned about their development and their use. They want to know. You know, am I eating something that's genetically modified? You know, I want to know. Although a lot of the crops that we have now are genetically modified, just not sciencey genetically modified, if that makes sense. Like, I mean, farmers for years and years and years have been selecting the traits they like the most and breeding those, which is basically genetic modification. The only difference is we're actually taking that gene out and putting it into the next plant instead of you know, allowing that to happen over generations. So we have cotton plants with BT, which then makes them resistant. You can buy corn and soybeans that are resistant to Roundup, which means then you can spray Roundup all over your crop and it will only kill the weeds, not your corn and soybeans. Um, so that's, folks find that pretty helpful. In about 13 years, the past 13 years, sorry, um, farmers have overwhelmingly, they're turning to GM soybeans, cotton, and corn because they do have all these benefits. But 99%, and you can see here, the most genetically engineered or bioengineered crops are corn, soybeans, canola, and cotton. Okay, so you can see the things that are most commonly genetically modified. I thought the dairy products was interesting because most people think about it as being plants, but dairy products obviously come from animals. So the objectives, the good things about genetically modified organisms. What are they? Why are they important? You know, what are some good things that they do? They can incorporate resistance to disease and pest, so you don't have to use as many pesticides. You can grow, you're more efficient growing per acre because you're not losing plants to pesticide or disease. It can increase your tolerance to environmental conditions, so like the increasing heat from climate change. It can improve the nutritional value. That's what this rice is actually. It's a type of rice called golden rice, the one on the right, and it actually has like extra vitamins and minerals and stuff like that in it. So you're getting, so that's really good for folks in maybe developing countries where they're not getting all of the nutrients they need because rice in itself doesn't have a ton. So they can eat this golden rice and then they'll get more of the nutrients they need. It would be great for my son who like is a toddler and doesn't eat anything but like rice and beans and bread. What can be. And then you can also produce pharmaceutical products and ordinary crop plants. And this is where a lot of people have some issues, right? Because they don't want to eat plants that may have had, you know, been growing also an ingredient for birth control, or they don't want to eat plants that have been grown close to, you know, something that was grown for diabetes or whatever, because sometimes these GM plants can crossbreed with local plants or things nearby, and so folks aren't really thrilled with that. So this is kind of this picture I was showing is the black picture is kind of an example of what I was talking about. This is, you know, farmers have been selectively the old corn crop, right, was this one, and this is what an ear of corn looked like, right? And they selectively bred the bigger and bigger and bigger ones, and now we have these giant ears of corn, right? That is selective breeding, right? That's the same quarter, right? It wasn't done by taking a gene from one and putting it to the other, but it still was basically modifying the genetics of the original plant. Okay. So the good things, we're not using pesticides. You're going to have less erosion. And then you're going to have less environmental damage caused by bringing more land into production. And also, right, you're getting, in this case, you're getting a better product, you're a more efficient product, right, because you're growing more food on each plant. Some problems with genetically modified organisms or GMOs is that if pests are exposed to the resistant incorporated plants, they tend to become more resistant to whatever that is, and then that makes the GM crop not so useful. Okay. Um, a lot of folks aren't certain about the ecological impact of these plants, right? When they hybridize with native plants or local plants. If, for instance, a crop plant that was resistant to Roundup uh, hybridized with a weed, then that Roundup gene might, get in the weed, and then the weeds are resistant to Roundup as well, which kind of makes the gene crop kind of useless. So some safety issues, folks are worried that the plants can produce new toxins or allergens. So basically, they found that there were these plants that had a Brazil nut gene, and they caused an allergic reaction in those folks that were allergic to Brazil nuts. However, this hasn't actually shown to be a problem in the last 13 years of using GMOs. So, there's a lot of folks that don't like GMOs, but there's also, some good behind it as well. It's kind of one of those things, take it in moderation. Folks worry that the pharmaceutical crops could contaminate ordinary food crops. This is an example. Do you want to eat corn that was contaminated with a pig vaccine? Is that something you want to eat, pig vaccine? So some problems with GMOs in the developing world, like a lot of folks say, oh, they're cheaper because you can grow more food per acre or whatever. Well, the thing about GMOs is it actually, you buy the seeds each year from whoever makes the GMO, usually I think Monsanto is the biggest company. So you buy the seeds from these companies, and then you plant your genetically modified plants, but you're not actually allowed to use the seeds from your plants. And they actually, they can actually like genetically test your plant to see if it's one of theirs. They put markers in them. So you must purchase the seeds annually, and if they find out that you're not, and you're growing your own, you can have a fine, or they can have legal action against you. But some of the seeds are spreading through seed piracy. Basically, folks are taking the seeds and spreading them even though they're not supposed to. But you're supposed to buy the seeds every year. So then a lot of folks are just worried about the unknown. They don't know the long-term effects of genetically modified food, so they just say they don't like it. And they don't like that it's not required to label GM foods, which they think that consumers should be able to make their own choices, whether they want to eat genetically modified foods or not, which I can get that. So there's one thing they take into account. In a lot of environmental science, this is a really key principle in all of environmental science. Is basically like the precautionary principle basically says, when you don't know what the issue could be, right? You don't know the possible effects, then they suggest that you basically are more cautious. Okay, if I don't know the problem and there's a threat of irreversible damage, we shouldn't say, okay, well, we don't really know what the cause is, so we're just not going to worry about regulating it. They see that you should use caution. So basically, if you don't know, then you should just act as if you did know, or act as if it did cause damage, just to be safe. So that's an important part, and you can use that for a lot of things. The precautionary principle can be applied in a lot of environmental science. So how much money is, what's the economics surrounding agriculture? Well, right now, agricultural products, in 2008 anyway, so that was 10 years ago, are worth about a little over $1 trillion. Okay, that's a lot. That's trillion, not billion, but trillion. Okay. So a lot of times developed nations will produce more food than they need. So they take that money and they sell it somewhere to other countries. But the only thing is that only works as well as long as the importing nation can pay cash for the food, right? Um, so if you are giving the food to a country that can afford it, you're not going to give your food to them, right? What do they say? Like nothing is free, or you can't get anything for free or whatever. So basically, we don't give our food or we don't sell our food to developing countries because they can't afford it. Okay, Japan, right? They're a very, very small country. They have a lot of people, but not a lot of land. They import $48 billion worth of food and livestock, but they can afford it because they export 596 billion in manufactured goods, right? So they can afford to buy $48 billion worth of food and livestock, where other countries might not be able to. Over the past 50 years, Asia and Africa are showing more dependence on imported grain, and these are also places that are experiencing the most rapid population growth. Okay. World grain supply has never run out in recent history. However, the total use of grain in 2008 exceeded production by 80 million tons. So if you think about rollover minutes, right? Like I use my phone for texting and data basically. I don't really use the minutes. So we have a lot of rollover minutes on our phone. Well, if we started talking more on our phones, let's say we put a teenager on our phone, or I mean, I don't know, do teenagers talk on their phones very much, or they just um, text? I don't know. My sister, when she was a teenager, she didn't really talk on her phone. But anyway, um, so let's say then we started using our minutes and we started using more minutes than we had each month. That was fine because we had this huge bank of rollover minutes. But eventually, if we're using more minutes than we're paying for or we're getting each month, eventually we're going to run out of that stockpile of rollover minutes, and we're going to, run out of rollover minutes, then we're going to, not have enough minutes each month for talking. So that's kind of like the world grain supply. We're using more than we are making. But it's okay because we've got a lot of extra right now, but that may not always be the case. From 2006 to 2008, food prices rose 100%. In some places, there were food riots, they had emergency measures, and basically the supply was unable to keep up with the demand. And what I like to think about is how sheltered we are and how out of touch we are with the rest of the world and what's going on in a lot of these developing countries. Did you even know that there was a food crisis in 2006 to 2008? Did you go hungry at all? I know I didn't. I had plenty of food. I still ate whatever I wanted. I went to restaurants and things like that. Because I'm just, in America, we're just totally out of touch with what's going on in the developing countries. We are kind of protected from that. So some causes of the global food prices were the higher production costs, using corn and other food to feed animals and also produce biofuels. The strong demand for higher quality diets, and that's the meat, right? That folks want more meat. And then weather-related shortfalls, and then the declining carryover stocks. So we didn't have as much to carry over from each year to the next because we're using so much. So then we can talk about the difference between, I think there's an FRQ as well on this test, this food production test. One of them asks you about malnutrition, undernourishment, and overnutrition. So malnutrition is basically the lack of essential nutrients. You're not getting the food that you need to survive, okay, or the nutrients you need to survive. And then undernourishment is the lack of adequate food. Okay, so you're not getting enough food. And then hunger is when you don't have enough food to provide basic energy and meet your nutritional needs. So you're getting hungry. It's too much. And then overnourishment is having too much food. So in the world, we've got these two problems. We've got this problem where some folks are not getting nearly enough food to eat, and other folks are getting way too much food to eat. So more than 1.3 billion people are overweight, and a third of the U.S. population is obese, more than 30 pounds overweight. So If you look at this family of 4, that is the food they get in a week. And you can see that a lot of the food that they buy comes in packages. Not a lot of it is fresh. There's a couple little fresh things in the middle, but most of it comes from a package. Okay, which is usually less healthy. So if you're hungry, about 1 billion people are hungry. They consider themselves hungry. They don't have enough to eat. And then 15 million in the rest of the world are underfed and undernourished. And then 11 million children under the age of 5 die in developing countries, and half of that, so that's like 5.5 million, is because of hunger. Okay, they just didn't have enough food to eat, and so they died. So what causes hunger? And the root cause is poverty, right? In most places, if you don't have enough money to buy food, you will be hungry. Okay, and what is that? That's poverty. Okay, and it's not necessarily in developing countries. You know, we've got a lot of folks in America that are in poverty. It's easier to be hidden in America, the folks that are hungry. So 1.4 billion people live in absolute poverty. That means they live on less than $1.25 a day. Okay, $1.25. That's hardly anything. And then 140 million children in developing countries are underweight, which means they're not meeting their growth timelines. They don't weigh enough. Famine is when you have a severe shortage of food, which greatly increases the death rate. And the big cause of famine, 2 main causes are drought. You don't have enough water, which means your food's not growing and your crops aren't going to grow. And then conflict, wars, things like that. So in drought, here's some examples. There's an area called the Sahel. It's south of Sahara. 70 million people live there. They have seasonal, undependable rainfall. And it says rainfall prone to failure, which means that a lot of times they don't get that rainfall. And so they've had 20 years of subnormal rainfall, not enough rain. So thousands died before aid could even be organized together and get people there to help them. And then again, deforestation causes desertification, which then causes massive dust storms. Okay, so cutting down forests to grow crops on seems like a good idea, and it is a good idea in the short term, but in the long term, it actually can cause desertification in areas like this, which means then nothing can grow there. And then conflict. Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Rwanda, Sudan, Mozambique, Angola, and Congo all had civil wars that disrupted the farmers' normal planting and harvesting, which then displaced millions from their homes. And just in Mozambique, 900,000 died. So it's almost 1 million folks died just in Mozambique conflicts and lack of food. So one of the things they worry about in giving food aid to folks, obviously, you see that and you're like, oh my gosh, give these people some food. But there's some issues with that. So when should we give food to those in need rather than distributed according to market economics? So basically, people will not pay more than they have to for food, right? They need food to feed their families, but they're not going to pay more than they have to if they don't have a lot of money. Okay, so if you give free food away or you give cheap food away, then those folks won't buy food from their local markets. And if they're not buying food from their local markets, then local folks are not getting money, from their neighbors, from selling their crops, which then, if they're not selling their crops, then, or they have to sell their crops cheaper than that foreign food, which, maybe it might be less than they need to survive or less than it's worth, then, it continues that cycle of poverty and hunger. And so they really, there's a fine line between just, let's just give these people the food that they need and letting them work for it, and not letting them work for it because they work cruel or anything like that, but letting them work for it so their local economies can start to grow. Eating locally kind of thing. So it's a very fine line. There are some folks now that kind of they look at trends in those areas and look at the weather in those areas, and they kind of predict, they can try and predict when these famines might occur. and things like that, and then try and organize aid quicker rather than that one, where thousands died before they even could get the aid organized, where they can kind of say, okay, we need to keep an eye on this area because it looks like, it is ripe for famine. And then they can kind of keep an eye on it rather than go, oh gosh, lots of people are dying, there's no food. Let's organize something and get some out there. They can kind of plan ahead.